Hi everyone. This is the second lecture of week 7, and I wanted to deal with specifically women in sport. And I have on here gender in sport. And the video you're watching for this week, of course, has to do with Title 9 and of course the effect that this had on women's college athletics specifically. But I want us to, because one thing that is very difficult often for us to understand when we're talking about topics such as race, such as gender, is how recent and how deeply embedded many of the thoughts that we now think of as being oftentimes backward or being perhaps, if we want to use the term politically incorrect, how really they were out in the open in the past, and how deeply embedded they are in a lot of our culture, and why, of course, they've taken so long to get rid of or to move past or to advance beyond or what have you. So when it comes to the role of women in society, we discussed this a bit a couple of weeks ago when we talked about, of course, masculinity in sports and the connection this had. And I said, of course, one of the things in regards to the late 19th century notion of masculinity is that there was this sense of a crisis of masculinity. And this crisis of masculinity was associated with industrialization. It was associated with the growth of cities. By the turn of the century, one of the areas that masculinity and the crisis involved in it had to do with was the fact that women were, of course, becoming more and more outspoken. They were calling for different rights and responsibilities. Of course, this was really in the United States. It's often seen as reaching an amazing milestone when women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, I believe. And what we need to understand is that, of course, for a lot of men, this was seen oftentimes as being a threat to their place within society. And this only advanced as the 20th century went on. We can see here an image of the flapper, the famous idea of the new women, quote unquote, of the 1920s. What, of course, made this woman into a new woman oftentimes had to do with her clothing choices, the look that she had, the amount of body that she might show, legs, ankles, arms, diving necklines, things of that sort. For the time period, for many, especially middle class people, these things were seen as being extremely radical. They were seen as being attempts for women to start to gain the place of men, to wear things and do things that were seen as being only available for men. So, for instance, one of the biggest signs of the controversial new woman wasn't just her dress and what she wore, which for us today we would see as being still very much feminine, but it would be the actions that she might take: smoking cigarettes, riding motorcycles, drinking alcohol, dancing wildly. These things were seen as being very unladylike, quote unquote. Well, not surprisingly, in the 1920s, as this image of the new woman came about, you also had a desire for oftentimes women becoming more physically active. This was not something necessarily new. Women were understood as needing to be physically active, like men, in terms of health. But what you started to get with the growth of mass media, as we've talked about, and international celebrity sports stars, is the ability of women to start to come to the fore into this same realm, just like you had with Babe Ruth. And actually, the most famous woman of the 1920s was Babe Didrikson, who was kind of infamous for being a multi-sports star. She could do a number of different things, as we can see here in her garb for the Olympics. She was a famous golfer. As we can see here, playing baseball. She was kind of one of these all-around absolute athletes who just, things came naturally to her. She, of course, was in many ways, though, at this point in time, seen as being an outlier. Not necessarily just a celebrity because of her abilities and her incredible abilities to reach a high level in the sports she played, but also as almost, and this is going to sound terrible, but almost as like a freak, somebody who was very intriguing because she could do all of these different things. In the post-World War II world, what we see is in many ways Diedrichson and her image really loses out to the idea of what middle-class Americans often want as their ideal for women. Both men and women would often speak of this, and this is this idea of the housewife, the notion that the Second World War really made, and the Depression specifically, made many people desire to go back to what was seen as being a traditional lifestyle. The white picket fence, the housewife who cleaned and cooked and raised the children while the man went out. This was depicted in American society as this tradition, even though it really, quite honestly, wasn't for this point in time. What you got was this, in many ways as well, a reaction against what was happening in the Soviet Union. The United States tried to differentiate itself from the Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union, where women were often seen as needing to play the same role as men in society, working often just as much. And hence, for the West, for the United States specifically, to identify ourselves as being different from the Soviet Union, the housewife would become one of those symbols to differentiate ourselves from Soviet women. We can also see this in the realm of religion, where a new interest and obsession with putting God into the public sphere really started to take off in the 1950s. So, for instance, putting in the Pledge of Allegiance, under God was added in the 1950s. All of the "in God we trust" that we see on much of our money was added in the 1950s. And this was done again to differentiate the United States from the quote-unquote godless Soviet Union. Now, the thing is, of course, that as much as this was depicted as being a wonderful lifestyle in which women were so happy and smiling, is, of course, this oftentimes was not a very fulfilling life. Women, for generations, had been calling for opportunities outside the home, for more equality. This, of course, had been an aspect of Western culture for a number of generations. As the 1960s started, the desire for women to gain independence, to start to have more rights and responsibilities, to start to work more, of course, became identified as the women's movement, women's liberation. And not surprisingly, this went hand in hand with the desire for sports. As women were understood as playing this traditional in the home part, the mother, the caretaker, the figure that is filled with emotion and love and softness for the family. Of course, as a group who desired to rebel against this, of course, sports were an excellent opportunity. And of course, there's just simply the fact that every human being in general enjoys sports. They enjoy to play. Many enjoy sports. They want to play sports. It has nothing to do with gender necessarily. And so by the 1970s, you started to see a rise in the number of women calling for equality in the realm of sports. Of course, very famously, you have the Billie Jean King match against Bobby Riggs, I'm sorry, that the idea of women being able to compete on the same level and even above men. This was, for its day, oftentimes a radical notion. Women were often thought to be not being able to play at the same level, not being able to do this naturally. Their competitive nature could not be on the same level as men. We have now, of course, have seen this as a complete misnomer in regards to what has come within the last 30, 40 years. Women's college sports have become enormous stories. Women's college basketball, the March Madness goes at the same time as March Madness for the men, oftentimes getting very high ratings. Of course, one of the great women athletes of the last 20 years who has taken on the role of, and actually overshadowing oftentimes, her male counterparts, Serena and Venus Williams, perhaps the greatest women's tennis player to ever live. And then, of course, as we can see, what's going on at this moment is a sport that, interestingly, women have taken the lead in, and that, of course, is soccer. In the realm of soccer, course, in the United States, male soccer is still oftentimes greatly overshadowed by football, by basketball, even by hockey and baseball. In the realm of women's soccer, the U.S. soccer team for women is generally considered to be the greatest international team out there. And this has a lot to do with the fact that the United States has not only had years and years of college soccer to produce all of these players, but you also have the situation in which as soccer was a area in which women could very much take over and not have male chauvinists trying to kind of overshadow them and say they'll never be to the extent of male soccer. And so what we see is actually the situation of what could happen in a lot of women's sports for the United States specifically in the future, is women often finding their own niche to very much show what can be done on an international, on a competitive, and on a superstar type level, as we see with Serena Williams and the U.S. women's soccer team. So to say that things are just like in the realm of race, that things have moved beyond what they were before, there's no doubt of that. Of course, we don't, in general, for most Americans, have a view of the 1950s housewife as being the ideal, and the idea that women taking part in athletics and being muscular and strong is in some way strange or only masculine. This has now lost much of its luster and become, for the most part, an idea that is dated and that really is not something that people will brag about at this point. However, to say that we have moved beyond these things would be an absolute misconception. The idea that we, just like in the realm of race, have become some sort of post-gender society in which women and men face the same problems, that they face the same obstacles, would be absolutely absurd to suggest. Women in sports still oftentimes face many more obstacles than the realm of men in sports, but again, to say that that we are in the same place, or we're not, or we're sitting still of where we were 20, 30, 40 years ago would be absolutely false. We're going to come back to much of this as well when we talk about politics in sports, of course, because these things are all tied up. Gender, race, politics, these things are all very much connected. And so we'll talk about this more next week.